Welcome back. So I'm very excited now to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, Peter Martin. Pete is the head of DFS's virtual currency supervision team. He joined DFS in January, and as the head of that team, he's responsible really for the licensing and supervision of the virtual currency entities under both our BIT license as well as trust licenses for all the crypto and virtual currency businesses that are operating in New York. Before joining DFS, Pete was at Promontory Financial, where he advised entities all across the crypto space on issues ranging from compliance with the travel rule to blockchain analytics. He also advised regulators on building supervisory guidance that's tailored to the crypto environment. All of which makes Pete's hire at DFS really a tremendously exciting event for us. I was really looking forward to today's conversation, in part because I've had the privilege of working closely with Pete since he got here, and it's always a lot of fun. Pete is he's really knowledgeable, he's very experienced, and he brings a tremendous passion for his work and for the crypto space. I think you're all going to get to see that today, especially for those of you who may be seeing Pete for the first time, the level of energy and the level of expertise that he brings. So I think we're fortunate at DFS to have him. I think really the public in the industry is fortunate as well, because we all benefit from having folks that are as knowledgeable and as engaged as Pete is. The subject of today's fireside chat is going to be focused on blockchain analytics. Certainly a lot of ground we could cover, and a tremendous amount that Pete is working on. I'm going to focus on blockchain analytics in part, right, because of the theme of the day, which is cyber and cybercrime type issues. And I think crypto's role in cyber and cybercrime has also been growing, right? Both because digital assets are appealing targets for cyber criminals, and because cyber criminals have been, as they always do, they can be early adopters, looking for ways to take advantage of crypto and crypto transactions to facilitate their crimes or launder their proceeds, for instance. So because of that, I know Pete's been focused on, despite all that he has on his plate, he's been very focused on the blockchain analytics tools and how to use them in the supervisory process, and how our licensees, our crypto companies, should be using them as well. So with that, welcome, Pete.
Thank you, Justin. I don't know if I can live up to the praise just bestowed, but I'll do my best.
Well, look, why don't you, I'm sure, given how recently you joined DFS, many of the folks here may not have, this may be the first time they're hearing from you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the virtual currency team at DFS does and your role?
Sure. Yeah. So for those who are not familiar, the virtual currency unit sits within research and innovation within the Department of Financial Services. We really handle everything from cradle to grave within the virtual currency space for our BIT licenses and our limited purpose trust companies. So that includes, applications both through intake through approval, as well as, ongoing supervision of our existing licensees, most notably, material changes to business and new product approvals, as well as on-site examinations. So for the purpose of this discussion, I think it'd be helpful to kind of keep geared towards, use of blockchain analytics throughout each of those, whether it's understanding that for an applicant that they understand their own business profile in light of their potential exposure to on-chain activity, as part of on-site examination, how we're really building out capabilities as part of the examination process to be able to understand what kind of exposure our existing licensees have, and as part of new product approval, how we can help our licensees to understand that these types of tools that really leverage these new capabilities and technologies can be built as part of the design phase, as we're seeing licensees with very ambitious product roadmaps across the board.
Great. And then what do we mean by virtual currency business? Right. I know that's a defined term in our regulation, also part of the name of your team. What does that cover?
Yeah, so I will point you to New York DFS 200. I think it's not two definitions for the textbook definitions, but I would note it's important to understand that right now we have 31 active virtual currency businesses. They really run the range from the more household names in virtual currency custody, stablecoin issuance, to your local bodega that might have a Bitcoin ATM operator, and really everything in between. So when we talk about virtual currency business activity, it can be the transmission and transfer of virtual currencies, holding and safekeeping on behalf of New Yorkers, and as we've seen here in New York, some of the first regulated examples of stablecoin issuance and asset tokenization, a lot of new use cases coming down the pike as well.
Great. And so I teased the topic up front, right? Blockchain analytics tools. So what are blockchain analytics tools, and why are they important in the virtual currency space?
Sure. So at a very high level, I would say, blockchain analytics, or some refer to as blockchain intelligence, describes the use of taking on-chain data. So, you think about whether it's Bitcoin or Ether or some new protocols coming online, you're able to do things with these types of payment transfers that isn't possible with fiat-based analogs. And by fiat-based, I just mean traditional banking, whether it's wires or other forms of payments. And what that allows you to do, because all of this activity is on chain, is allow for meaningful clusters of wallet addresses so that you can understand, this basket of wallet addresses is associated with an entity, which in turn is interacting with other entities in a way that allows you to do, really novel things, from provenance tracing to be able to go back several hops, whether it's Bitcoin or Ether or other protocols, as well as to be able to understand, new typologies or assess against existing typologies across a myriad of different controls, and to understand, what at the entity level, your exposure looks like, as well as really pin down, just in hearing the customer, what is his inbound, outbound activity, who is he himself interacting with, in a way that allows you to understand the customer and the entity in a way that, really is novel in the context of the virtual currency space.
Right. And so there was an announcement recently, right, that DFS is bringing in blockchain analytic tools for our own use, right? I first became familiar with these tools, I guess, more than 5 years ago when I was a prosecutor, and specifically focused on cybercrimes work, and sort of the age-old investigative technique, follow the money, as for quite some time in cybercrimes meant follow the crypto. But obviously the application is different here, right? What is DFS using and planning to use blockchain analytic tools for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, it's nearly every day that I'm speaking with, either a federal counterpart or a foreign regulator. And I think there's a very clear sense that, from a reg tech or supervisory tech perspective, our own ability to leverage these on-chain and off-chain verification capabilities is a way that we can really build out our real-time supervisory awareness of our licensees. So, just to take a step back, you mentioned kind of the evolution of use of blockchain intelligence. I think years ago, one would think about it as almost exclusively a forensic tool. So, for complex investigations, how can we go back on the blockchain in order to say, what is the exposure, who's like pseudonymous wallet addresses, to be able to see, what is the association with different activities. So it's kind of deep forensic intelligence. As the industry has grown, and really a credit to the service providers in the space, have really become much more complex over a very short period, we've also seen use cases that are more aligned to traditional transaction monitoring and sanction screening services that we see in the traditional financial space. So to that end, you can imagine, okay, I see on-chain activity, how can we create behavioral rules and kind of the hub and spoke traditional types of rules to assess, okay, is this potentially unusual or suspicious activity? So potential deep forensics, rules-based alert generation, and same can be said for sanction screening. And then, more broadly, whether it's fraud or KYC, how can we understand customer activity to be consistent with its business profile for that activity? So that's kind of on the entity side. And then you imagine, well, listen, if we've turned on these tools ourselves, I can look on a real-time basis to see what is the transaction volume and value for our own entities, and have already had documented instances where, we're reaching out directly to our entities to help understand, what kind of activity they might have exposure to. So really working towards formalizing our own use of these blockchain analytics vendors as part and parcel for ongoing supervision on an ad hoc or daily basis with our licensees, as well as integrate it as part of on-site examinations, so that we can understand what are the customization choices these entities are using, really consistent with their own business profile against the off-the-shelf capabilities. Make sense?
Right. Yeah, it does make sense. And I think that, as you said earlier, right, and as I had personally experienced, those kind of blockchain analytic tools have, at this point, a reasonably long history at law enforcement agencies, but it's a pretty new tool for regulators to embrace, right?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think everything moves at the speed of light in the virtual currency space. So, you think even the BitLicense regime is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, crypto supervisory framework out there. It was invented before, the Ethereum protocol even really came online. So I would say, the space is moving very quickly, and, that necessarily means that we need to have an active dialogue with both our applicants and licensees around what best practices look like, as well as the service provider community itself in terms of, developing, helping support, what are their product roadmaps look like to help ensure that, they're aware of what our needs are in the RegTech space. And, just a plug for, new activities coming online, just because so much of this is so new and moving so quickly, really just, as we're speaking with our licensees, as they develop new products, making sure that risk management and AML and compliance have a seat at the table so that they can get comfortable with these use cases and, really build that out from the design phase, whether it's, a new issuance of a stable coin on a new protocol, or, launching of a new coin within the existing custody framework, or any number of use cases.
Right. And when I hear you say that, right, it sounds to me like the analog of what we often say on the security side, which is, security should be built in from the design phase onward. And that's going to put you in a much better position than trying to graft it on later. Right. And I hear you say something very similar about AML compliance, sanctions compliance, and those aspects of the new products that are being developed in this space.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about how some of these tools work and how some of the new products are forming in practice, there's a lot of design choices right down to the smart contract code and, what the interactions are between users and, the networks themselves. So, the more that you can integrate, whether it's blockchain analytics or market surveillance or valuation, the list really goes on in terms of how do you graft on, more fiat-based rules and expectations, on top of DFS 200, which gives pretty clear guardrails around what good looks like. And then, to your point, New York specific DFS 500, and I would add, DFS 504, which really goes into more clear guidance around what is the data lineage expectations, what kind of model validations are you doing with each of these systems, to get you and your team comfortable in this really quickly moving space, to identify potentially unusual activity. Right.
And I love how I think you haven't even hit 4 months yet. We've already got you steeped in DFS jargon. For those who aren't, right, Part 200 is, we often call that the BitLicense reg. That's the virtual currency reg. Part 500 is our cybersecurity regulation, and Part 504 is the transaction monitoring regulation that DFS has, right? And I think one thing that's interesting about blockchain analytics tools and their use in virtual currency companies or businesses that are involved in virtual currency, even traditional banks, is that it does sit at the intersection of these different subject areas and the different regulatory regulations that we have at DFS.
Yeah, and I think that will always be true in the virtual currency space. So, I think if anything, Justin and his team are being modest here. We lean very heavily on cyber, whether it's through on-site examinations or new products, because so much of this starts and ends with not only, is this AML compliant, but what is the intersection of AML and fraud in this space? How do we get comfortable from a disaster recovery, business continuity planning perspective? How do these different tools integrate into overall transaction monitoring systems in a way that I think just is moving much more rapidly than in the traditional fiat space? And, they all have to come together, from day one in order for it to be functional.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So look, for our licensees, right, for New York crypto companies, what are we hoping to see from them in terms of how they're using blockchain analytic tools? And make it a compound question, should they, are there specific features or capabilities that virtual currency companies should be looking at obtaining?
Yeah, I mean, I would hasten to add that what the New York licensees have been doing is, I think, something against whether it's 200 or 504, they've been subject to a lot of these standards in a way that, we've been speaking with, whether it's, as part of our point of contact meetings or as part of examination. So there shouldn't be many surprises, at least for the New York licensees. But maybe just to broaden the point to the virtual currency community more generally, I think it is the understanding that these tools have, become much more complex and are capable of doing a lot, whether it's rules engines, counterparty exposure verification that you can help embed in, as part of your travel rule solution. And really the job begins and ends with the licensee if they're going to outsource for these vendor tools, but these vendor tools have become much more complex over time. So, when we're on site, what we'll be asking is questions around, what customization choices did you make against your specific business profile so that, these are not just off the shelf capabilities. So, we're seeing a lot of capabilities to customize, like turning the knobs and bells within these tools. And I would add, our licensees are very much aware, and just for the broader community, there's kind of a sense over the past few years, I use X vendor, but even within the vendor product suite, it could be very discrete products for, your rules engine, your counterparty verification tool, attribution tool, your deep forensic capability for transaction monitoring and sanction screening. So, you should expect to say, okay, licensee title for transaction monitoring and blockchain analytics procedures to very clearly articulate how you are embedding these tools into your overall risk and compliance framework. And just to bring it back to the human factor, that begins and ends with personnel who have clear knowledge of how these tools work specific to the business profile. So I think, the having certifications is a start, but really being able to speak critically and credibly around where these tools begin and end and where the job picks up for bank specific controls, whether it's through manual transaction monitoring reviews or, frontline customer activity for the personnel to understand, how do they get comfortable with onboarding a customer up through SAR filing or voluntary self-disclosures.
Well, look, I know we could probably go all day here. There's a ton of ground to cover. I also don't want to shortchange the terrific panel that we have coming up. So maybe I will just say, any final thoughts on this space that you want to share with our audience, or any takeaways you'd like them to have.
Sure. I would just say at a high level, stay tuned. The virtual currency unit has a lot in the pipeline. You can expect guidance specifically on the use of blockchain analytics in the next week. And then, because I end every call with a plug for hiring, we also are hiring in the virtual currency unit. I think we have 7 openings right now. Please do consider applying. It is a fantastic place to work.